Knits. I'm here to talk to you today about knitting gadgets that you don't need. If you have these things and they work for you and you like them, great. That is perfectly fine. My intent here today is really to kind of cut through a lot of the marketing and influencing that is present in all industries, and knitting is not immune to it, where everyone's kind of showing off the latest and greatest thing and telling you what's so wonderful about it, why you have to buy it, and can sometimes make people feel a little bit overwhelmed and unsure of what it is they need, what is worth their money, if they have a limited amount of money to invest, where that money should be going, or feeling dissuaded from trying knitting or trying new things in knitting because they don't have the latest and greatest tools. So all of these things you might find useful depending on your knitting style. You may just like to have them because they make knitting easier or more fun, but you can knit perfectly well without these things. That's why I'm here today, just to kind of cut through some of the hey, this is the latest thing and you absolutely need it that we're seeing everywhere all the time, and just point out a few things that, hey, you don't actually need this. And then I'm also going to share with you one thing that I think you absolutely do need, is worth the money for your knitting, and it's actually not a knitting tool, but we'll get to that at the end. All right, so the first thing I'm going to tell you about that you don't need for knitting is fancy stitch markers. They're nice to have. They make your knitting look pretty, and if you like them and want to spend money on them, great. Good for you, but you don't need them. So this is my repurposed Altoids tin full of fancy stitch markers. And I don't actually use them because what I've found is that over time, these kind of stitch markers that are very pretty and are made with wire, the wires start to loosen up and they start to snag my knitting. And that seems to be true no matter what kind it is. If it is something made with wire, eventually the clasps and the joins and the wires loosen up, it starts to snag my knitting. So I don't use any of these. I guess a couple of them are actually Progress Keepers, which are a little different. And I have survived just fine without them. So if you don't need the fancy stitch markers, what can you use? This is my jar of what I guess are called bulb safety pins, or in the knitting world, we call them locking stitch markers. So it is just a safety pin without the coil that has a bulb on one end, which is helpful if you're using larger needles, and they can be unpinned and repinned if you need to mark a specific stitch, or move your marker once you're actually knitting. I got a bag of 500 of these from Amazon for less than 10 bucks. There are different colors, so there's like gold, bronze, silver, and black. So if I need to differentiate between, you know, different parts of my knitting for any reason, I can use different colors. And they work perfectly fine. They don't snag my knitting. Because there's no coil in there that's going to, you know, there's no bent wire that's going to loosen up over time. If they did, you know, maybe a pin got out of whack and it wouldn't close right, I could just throw it away because, like I said, 500 of them cost me less than 10 bucks. So that is what I use most of the time these days for my knitting. So if you like fancy stitch markers, you like having them on your knitting, they work for you, great, more power to you, but you don't need them. You do need some kind of stitch marker, but a bag of 500 for under 10 bucks is a pretty easy investment, and they work for pretty much anything that I need them for. So fancy stitch markers, not necessary. Bulb safety pins, 10 bucks for 500, perfectly good. The next thing that I'm going to tell you that you actually don't need to knit are cable needles. This is, I guess, when I started knitting, I got like a learn to knit set or book or something, and this was in there, and I think there's probably another one too that's a heavier gauge. But one, learning to knit without a cable needle is a fantastic skill that makes cabling so much faster. So if you haven't checked that out, definitely give that a look. But two, if you are still using a cable needle, you can just use a short DPN. You don't need a special needle. I mean, yeah, this is a little smaller than a DPN, I mean, in terms of its length. So maybe it's a little more convenient in that way, but you probably already have DPNs. You probably have sets of them because they usually come in sets of 4 or 5, whereas this, you know, there's only one. And if I lose this, I'm out of luck. If I lose a DPN, there's probably 3 or 4 more from the same set that I can use. They also come in different sizes, obviously, so they can match the gauge of your project. So if you have cable needles and you find them useful, again, great. But if you don't and you're interested in cabling, don't feel like you need to go out and buy a whole new set of special cable needles. You really don't need to. You can use a spare DPN just as well. Another thing I will sometimes use if I'm working like really wide cables that I really do need to put them on a spare needle in order to work the cable, are these stitch holders, which again, I got a million years ago. These are really cheap. I think they're from Clover. And these are handy to have. But you just take this off and here's your, you know, it's just like a mini DPN. Use it as a cable needle. Not have to buy, you know, an extra set of some needles that you're not going to use, because this you're going to be able to use for other things because it's a stitch holder and that is what it's for. So one, cabling without a cable needle, definitely look into it. I have a video. And two, more importantly, use a spare DPN, use a stitch holder. You don't need to go out and invest in special cable needles for cable knitting. All right, the next 2 things I'm going to talk about, I don't even have, so I'm just going to have to pop some photos in here. The first one is a row counter. Here's what that looks like. There is almost no chance I'm going to remember to click this thing at the end of every row. I'm just not. And so I feel like this is actually more likely to cause confusion because maybe it has some number on it, but wait, did you actually click it? You remember you got to the end of the row. Did you click it? Doesn't seem like you clicked it. Maybe you did click it. Maybe this number's right. Maybe it's wrong. That seems more anxiety inducing than not having a row counter at all. But what if you need to count rows? You can actually just count your rows. There are some situations in knitting where you do need to keep track of how many rows you've worked. But the great thing about knitting is that you can just go back and look at what you knit and count the number of rows. If you are supposed to work a certain number of rows in between your increases and decreases, it's pretty easy to see where you've increased and decreased. If that gives you a little trouble, you can use these locking stitch markers again to mark where you've increased and decreased, and then just count the rows in between your stitch markers. Every V is a row. It's relatively simple unless you are working with really dark fuzzy yarn at night and you don't have your glasses on. But most of the time, trying to use a row counter, personally, I find that it's just actually going to make me more anxious because I'm not going to remember if I clicked it or not. And I know there are kinds that, I don't know, are automatic and are supposed to do it themselves. I have no idea if those work. But it's quite simple just to go back and count your number of rows. So again, if having a row counter works for you, great. If you don't have one and are thinking if you need one, no, you do not. I mean, they're relatively cheap, the clicky ones, but still, if you have a limited amount of money to invest in your knitting hobby, that is not where your money needs to go, at least in my opinion. So row counters, not all that helpful. And the next one, I don't have one. I did used to, many, many years ago. But this is a yarn guide. And this is something that you would use to work color work. And you would thread the yarn through so that you can carry two yarns across your row and alternate between them as you're doing color work. The wire ones tend to snag on your yarn. The plastic ones just really aren't sturdy enough to do much of anything. And with a little bit of practice, you can basically do the same thing on your own without the guide. You can tension both yarns over one finger and just alternate between them. Again, it does take some practice. Again, I have a video where I show you how I do this, but you don't need a special tool in order to be able to do color work. If you aren't ready to try to tension both yarns over one finger, you can just alternate until you are ready. But once you are ready and you've practiced and you've got it down, you really don't need the yarn guide. So if you happen to have one, great. If you love yours and it works for you, great. This isn't to say that they aren't useful to some people, but do you need them to knit? You really don't. So take it or leave it. Yarn guide, not the be all and end all. You can absolutely do color work without one. And the last knitting gadget that you definitely don't need are sock blockers. I have sock blockers. These are custom made sock blockers that I got on Etsy a couple of years ago. You can see they have my name on them. And they're great for taking pictures of socks. Do I need them to actually block socks? No. Socks, for starters, definitely you should block them, but it can be as simple as soaking them, squeezing out the water and smoothing them out and laying them flat to dry. You don't really want to stretch socks out because socks are supposed to have negative ease. That is what's going to help them keep their shape around your foot. So one, sock blockers may actually end up overstretching your socks, but two, you can do just as well without them. Again, they're nice for photos, and that is why I have these. And in fact, these are really fun in that you can adjust the size of them. And I have used these to block my socks, but do I absolutely need them? No, you don't. You can just as easily block your socks without them. And as I said, they actually, in some cases, if you're not using quite the right size sock blockers, you do risk overstretching your socks, which you don't want. Socks need to have negative ease to keep their shape. So again, if you have sock blockers and you love them and they work for you, great. But they are not a requirement for knitting socks. Unless you know, if you're a designer and you like to take photos of your socks and you want them to look good, really helpful. And you know, having something with your name on it is always fun too, but they are absolutely not essential. So don't feel like you can't start knitting socks just because you don't have sock blockers. You definitely can. All right, and then I promised I was going to tell you about one knitting gadget that you really do need, and it's actually not a knitting gadget at all. It's a kitchen scale. Take 20 bucks and invest in a digital scale because it's going to make your knitting life so much easier. A digital scale is the easiest way to find out exactly how much yarn you have used and exactly how much yarn you have left for a project, which is going to help you for a number of reasons. For starters, let's say you are not sure if you're going to have enough yarn for sleeve number 2. So you weigh your sweater with no sleeves. You weigh it again after you've knit sleeve 1. Now you know exactly how much yarn you have used for sleeve 1, and you can tell, oh, I'm gonna have to buy more yarn for sleeve 2, or no, I'm not, I'm fine, I'm good. Which is, you know, always what we hope. Second, you will be able to know exactly how much yarn you've used for a project, which is gonna help you to buy yarn for future projects and make sure that you don't over or under buy. This is not an exact science, but if you have already knit a worsted weight pullover at a gauge of 4 stitches to the inch, and you want to knit another worsted weight pullover at a gauge of 4 stitches to the inch, you're going to use about the same amount of yarn, no matter what the pattern says. with the exception of, you know, one of your pullovers is plain stockinette and the other one is full of cables. That's obviously different. But assuming that basically the measurements of the two sweaters in question are similar, and there's no stitch patterns or other things that are going to significantly use more or less yarn, you're going to use about the same amount of yarn if you're working at the same gauge. So now, you know, maybe the pattern says you need 1,500 yards, but you know that you actually only need 1,425. Maybe that's a whole ball of yarn you're saving yourself from buying. So things like that. It is super helpful to know exactly how much yarn you have used for a number of different reasons. Now, obviously, if you're a designer, it's essential, but even if you're not, being able to tell how much yarn you've used and how much yarn you have left is really helpful in your knitting life. And there are ways to estimate, etc., etc. But honestly, for 20 or 25 bucks, buy your digital scale, no more estimating. You can know exactly what you've got left, exactly what you've used, no more questions about it. So, you know, hop on Amazon and grab one. You can also use it in your kitchen, which I do sometimes. That is what it is for. But that shouldn't be, you know, if you're not going to use it in your kitchen, that's okay. It's still worth it just for your knitting. Digital scale, you will always know how much yarn you've used and how much you have left. And that is pretty priceless when you are working on big projects like sweaters. All right, so there you have it. 5 knitting gadgets you don't actually need and 1 non-knitting gadget that you really do need for your knitting. Thank you so much for joining me for this video. If you have ideas for future videos, something you would like to hear about in a vlog or an upcoming podcast, or a tutorial that you're interested in, click the link in the description box down below to fill out the form and let me know what it is you are interested in seeing over here. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you know when new content goes up, which is almost always on Saturdays. Thank you again for joining me for this video, and I will see you again in an upcoming video.